that festival is good for you all. Here in the UK, we are facing pretty private festivals and Sedarim. I think my call at the end of the Seder will be next year in person. I don't care where, just in person. So it's going to be quite quiet, but one of the benefits of it, last year we did it too, is oddly enough, I mean, Sedarim with large numbers of people and family and crowds and whatnot have their own quality, but there's endless amounts of compromise, isn't there, as it goes a bit too fast, or you can't discuss what you wanted to discuss, or you can't think about something, or it can't go fast enough for you, or somebody wants to sing that tune again when you never get to sing your tune. Well, when you're on your own, you can sing whatever tune you like. You can get to bed by 8:30 if that's your plan, or you can be up till 3, and you can read what commentaries you like, and you can even ask questions to which you know the answers, which is always very satisfying. So anyway, that's Seder. So in the Seder, as you know, and as I have said to CSP audiences in the past, I just need to state my own bias so you know where I'm coming from. My tradition is from within the Orthodox tradition, and therefore when I refer to liturgy and text, the one I know is the Orthodox one. So I don't know whether there are complete commonality between the different denominations, and it may be that I refer to things which don't appear in your traditions, okay? But I hope I'm explanatory enough as we go along that we won't leave anybody behind. And I'm definitely have no intention of being particularly obscure. So don't think I'm going to chase you down byways that ordinary people can't possibly go to. So let's come to this number 5. Those of you who have thought about the Seder, or even if you haven't thought about the Seder, you know that 4 is the magic number, okay? You look at the Seder and 4 crops up at least 3 times, okay? There's the 4 children, right? The wicked and the wise and all that. There are the 4 questions, Manishtana halayla hazeh. There are the 4 cups, right? 4 cups of wine. So why would I suggest that 5 is the number? So first of all, let's remember what 4 represents in the world, right? 4 is the number of our reality, okay? There are 4 dimensions. Well, you're all familiar with the 3 dimensions of space, depth and width and length, right? There's 3D things in 3 dimensions. The 4th dimension is time, within which we live, right? We talk about what happened last year and what we hope for next year. So these 4 dimensions are the way in which we live life. We live life in concrete worlds, things of 3 dimensions, and we live it through time, 4 dimensions. That's the reality of our world. That's the frame, the thing that we can understand, unless we're extremely complex physicists and are off on string theory and parallel universes and whatnot. But generally speaking, 4 dimensions is what we have. What can the 5th dimension be? Or what could it be? Or has anybody experienced a 5th dimension? Or what could that look like? What would it be to live beyond the 4 dimensions? Now, this is not a conversation about theology or philosophy, but just think about this, right? Those of us who believe in God believe in a God who is beyond time in some way. Certainly this idea of infinite has always existed, will always exist, so not bounded by time, but is also endlessly present. That is, God is not a being with a past and a future. God isn't wondering what's going to happen tomorrow, right? It already knows what's going to happen tomorrow. God lives forever. So the past is now, the present is now, the future is now. To God, God doesn't live within the restrictions of time, nor, of course, does God live within the restrictions of the 3 dimensions of physical space, right? God's not restricted by depth or height or width or whatever. There's no corporeal identity. So God is not bounded by the 4 dimensions. God lives beyond the 4 dimensions in this number 5. To be slightly fanciful about it, perhaps, for those of you who know Hebrew and know the Hebrew alphabet, you know that the Hebrew alphabet represents numbers also, right? In classical Hebrew, there's no numerals. If you want to write a number, you use Hebrew letters. And of course, the Hebrew letter for 5 is a hey, right? Hey, huh. And when those of us who don't like to write the name of God in Hebrew want to write it, how do we write it? We write a hey. A hey represents God. It's short for Hashem, the name. We just write a hey. Okay, so 5 in some ways has a lot of connections with God. But we're not there. We live in 4 dimensions. So let's just start with the 4 cups. Right, the 4 cups of wine, as you probably know, are celebratory things. I'm very struck by the fact that American Kiddush wine, you know, Manischewitz or something like that, says on the bottle, I think it still does, we don't tend to get it here in the UK, but when I've seen it, says on the bottle, I think, for sacramental purposes, right? Now, of course, as you probably know, Kiddush is not sacramental, right? A sacrament is something of holy quality. This can only be administered by a specially qualified priest. Well, of course, we are anyway a kingdom of priests, so we can do all this stuff ourselves. But nevertheless, the wine that we drink, even though you may be familiar with the concept of kosher wine, wine is just wine. And it doesn't matter how much Hebrew you say over it, it doesn't change into anything else. It remains wine. And by the way, Kiddush wine remains not very nice wine, right? And you can mumbo jumbo endlessly, and it's still not very nice wine. It doesn't matter what you do to it, it remains not very nice wine. But nevertheless, on the bottle, it says for sacramental purposes only. Why? Well, this is American history, right? During Prohibition, you weren't allowed to buy and sell wine, unless, of course, remember the Catholic Church, it was for sacramental purposes. Then, of course, you could turn up to church and get a swig. And so Jews took, in America, to putting for sacramental purposes on their bottles of wine. But the fact of the matter is that when Jews say Kiddush over a cup of wine, they are not blessing the wine is not becoming sacramental, it's not turning into anybody's blood, it's simply wine. And the reason why we drink wine is because, as the rabbis say in the Talmud, there is no celebration without wine. So when we want to have a celebratory event, as a festival should be, we have a cup of wine. You're all familiar with that from Friday night, from Shabbat. It's not a special Pesach thing. We have a cup of wine. But on Pesach, the rabbis noted 4 different terms used in the Torah to describe what God did for us when he led us out of Egypt. He redeemed us, he led us out, he saved us, all these different kinds of words. So the rabbi said, well, we should celebrate the fact that God redeemed us. Let's have a cup of wine. We should also celebrate that God saved us. Let's have another cup of wine. We should also celebrate, right? So the 4 words, 4 cups of wine. It's very simple. Easy. That's why we have 4 cups of wine, guys. If it had been a 10-word sentence, we would be under the table, right? But 4 words, we can just about make it through to the end of Seder. But there is a 5th word, right? And the 5th word is, in fact, about God redeeming or saving us. And the rabbis couldn't decide whether this had been done, right? When God performed the Exodus, was it just the conclusion of the Exodus when either we got to Sinai or later on when we got to the land of Israel or what? Or did it refer to the Messianic age? Was that the redemption that was being talked about? And therefore they couldn't decide whether we should indeed have a 5th cup, 5 cups, or whether we should have 4 cups. Now, you may be familiar with the rabbinic tradition that when you can't decide on something, which doesn't matter very much, let's be clear. If you have to decide on something, is this kosher or isn't it here now, right? Is this fellow supposed to, stop claiming this property, or give it back or not, right? The court has to come to a decision. But when it's involved in trying to decide some ritual technicality, it doesn't have to decide now. It's not critical. Life doesn't collapse if a decision's not made. And so what the rabbis in the Talmud not infrequently say is, we'll leave it to Elijah. Right? There's a tradition that Elijah will come to herald, to announce the coming of the Messiah. And when he does, he will resolve all outstanding problems so that when the Messiah arrives, everything will be nice and smooth and ready for him. I should just say, by the way, I said at the outset that my tradition is Orthodox, but I do want to stress I'm not overly sold on the concept of the Messiah, right? I mean, it's a nice repository into which to put concepts, but I'm much more interested in the Messianic age than the person, right? My own feeling is, knowing Jews, that's unlikely that there'll be a Messiah. I think there will be a Messianic committee, is my feeling, because that's how Jews like to do things. But nevertheless, whatever we do, right, the Messiah, the person is not the critical thing. The critical thing is the age, the dream of the age, the aim of the age, right? One way or another, anyway, the rabbis in the Talmud say that Elijah will come and will resolve outstanding difficulties. So here's one. Should we have 4 cups or should we have 5? And you all know how they resolve this problem. We pour a 5th cup. We pour it for Elijah, right? So Elijah will come and decide, does he drink the 5th cup or doesn't he? By the way, those of you who are into interfaith stuff and Christian Jewish stuff, you will know that many people think that the Last Supper, Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples, was a Pesach Seder. Not sure about that, but nevertheless, that's their conviction, right? You may know that this Sunday is the beginning of what's called Holy Week, leading up to Easter, right? This Sunday is called Palm Sunday, right? Because in the New Testament, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, right? And the people throw down palms and call out Hosanna. You've all seen the film, you know, right? They call out Hosanna, 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 right? Okay, you all know that. That's a week before the Last Supper. Well, any intelligent Jew knows that must be wrong. Jews do not have palms around a week before Pesach. When do we have palms? It's Sukkot. And furthermore, what do we do on Sukkot? We sing Hosanna es Hoshanot, right? So I think the New Testament has compressed the narrative into a week, which actually, does make the Jews sound very fickle, right? This great guy arrives, all tremendously excited. 1 week later, we go, Lozum, we don't care, right? It's really not a good look. But if Jesus had got on his donkey and arrived in Jerusalem at Sukkot time in, say, October, and everybody had been wildly enthusiastic at the Messiah, I don't know about everybody, but whoever was wildly enthusiastic at the Messiah's arrived, and 6 months later, nothing's happened, then you can imagine why they go, well, it's nothing, right? So anyway, at that Last Supper, as you may know, Jesus famously takes a cup of wine and says, when you drink this, think of me and this shall be my blood. And then he takes some bread and he says, when you think of me, this will be my body. He doesn't do it that way. He does bread first and then wine, right? We always talk about the bread and wine of communion or the Mass or Eucharist or whatever, right? That's very strange for Jews. We never do bread and wine. We always do wine and bread, right? The wine always comes first. Wine and bread, not bread and wine. What's going on? On what occasion do we do bread and wine? Pesach. And what is the wine that comes after the meal? not least the cup of Elijah. If, and I'm speculating here, if Jesus had the tradition of pouring a cup of wine for Elijah, who is going to come and settle matters before the Messiah comes, and Jesus then picks up this cup and drinks from it, this is a gasp moment for the disciples, because this is an assertive statement saying, at minimum, I am Elijah and I can decide. Or at maximum, there is no further problem, guys, because you are now able to celebrate the redemption, the coming of the Messiah. Anyway, the fifth cup. So when we talk about 4 cups, don't forget that there are actually 5. Let's come to the 4 questions. You all know the 4 questions, right? Why is this night different from all other nights, right? Why do we eat matzah? Why do we eat bitter herbs? Why do we dip twice? Why do we lean when we eat? Yes, those 4 questions. Are you all watching? You know the 4 questions. Shall I go through them again? Why is this night different from all other nights? Why do we eat matzah? Why do we eat maror? Why do we dip twice? Why do we lean when we eat? Yeah, 4 questions. You got them? Okay. So those of you who know Hebrew will know that actually that's not a problem, because ma nishtana halayla hazeh, right? Why is this night different from all other nights? It's not necessarily the way we have to translate it, right? It's more like, or potentially, a kind of exclamation. How different this night is from all other nights. Why do we eat matzah? Why do we eat bitter herbs? Why do we dip twice? Why do we lean when we eat? Those are the 4 questions. The manishtana at the beginning is not really a question, or perhaps it's a kind of overarching question. So the 4 questions. Well, first of all, let's just remember, folks, when we talk about the 4 questions, I don't know if you've noticed, we never answer them. Not really, right? This is a really important educational lesson. When children ask you questions, don't give them a straight answer, because a straight answer closes down the conversation, right? You should always frustrate children in education. It's a critically important thing. Never satisfy a child. Never let a child think, we've come to the end of the story, right? Because if you say, why does the earth go around the sun? Because it does. End of conversation, nothing more to say, right? You say, that's a very interesting thing, I'm not sure we really understand it. Actually, it's quite an interesting question. Now you've opened up the whole topic, right? But the child asked the question, why do we eat matzah? Why do we lean? We never explain why we lean. Have you noticed? Why do we dip twice? We never explain why we dip twice, right? Why do we eat maror? Well, that comes later on. Because the kids ask some straight questions. Why are we eating matzah? And we go, we were slaves in Egypt, and I'm going to grind through the whole story, and I'm going to go on and on. And if you're still awake in 2 hours' time, I'll get around to mentioning matzah, right? It's very strange. Is this the proper way to answer a child? The 4 questions. But there are 5. There are 5 questions, folks. According to the Mishnah, when you ask questions, you should ask these questions. Why do we have matzah? Why do we have maror? Why do we dip twice? And why do we eat roast lamb? Well, we don't. Or mostly we don't. I think some Sephardim have the tradition of having roast lamb, but Ashkenazim definitely don't. And most Ashkenazi families even scrupulously go out of their way to avoid having anything that looks like roast lamb. I don't know what your tradition is, but that certainly is the case here. We don't have roast meat. Why not? Because we don't want anybody to fall into the mistake of thinking that we are actually eating the Paschal sacrifice, because since the temple was destroyed, the Paschal sacrifice became a dead letter. We don't eat the Paschal sacrifice. We don't have roast meat. You'll all be familiar with the fact that on the Seder plate, right, we have a roast bone. Now, most people do. If you're a vegetarian, like we are, we have a picture of a roast bone, right? Doesn't matter, because the bone is only symbolic of what ought to be there. And if it's a bone is symbolic of a lamb, then a picture of a bone can be symbolic of a bone, which is symbolic of a lamb, right? That's no problem there. So when we point out the three critical features of the Seder, the Matza, the Maror, and the Pesach, the Paschal lamb, we pick up the Matza, we say Matza. We pick up the Maror, we say Maror. And we point to the Pesach and we say Pesach, right? We don't pick it up because it is not the thing. It is only a symbol of the thing, right? So originally there was a question, why do we eat roast meat? But that question had to fall because we don't anymore. So they introduced this new question of why do we lean when we eat? We all know the answer to that, because we're like rich people luxuriating at a Roman banquet, and you know, we don't care about dropping matzo crumbs on the floor, right? So that thing, right? It's the only time when children are told, sit up to the table, sit up, right? Go, no, don't sit up, lean back, get up, right? Very confusing. So why do we lean when we eat? That means to say that this question about roast lamb now has gone away. And I don't know how many of you subscribe to the conviction, but those of us who are in the Orthodox camp will know that at least within Orthodox liturgy, there is a continuing desire to return to the temple, that sooner or later the temple will be rebuilt and we will be able to reinstitute temple worship, I say, because, well, will we reintroduce temple sacrifice? Less clear. Some think that'd be a fabulous thing. Maimonides wasn't so sure, right? But one way or the other. However, it remains possible, therefore, if we project forward into the Messianic age, the temple rebuilt, that we have 5 questions again. 5 questions. So 5 cups if we get to the Messianic age, 5 questions if we get to the Messianic age. What about the 4 children? Well, you all know these, the 4 children. You've got the wise one who knows everything and wants to know more, right? Gifted and talented, whatever you call them over there in America. The kids in the fast track, high capacity, get on your nerves kids, right? Who can't stop wanting to know more, those ones, who take a volume of an encyclopedia into the loo toilet with them because they can't stop reading, right? There's the wise one. Then you've got the wicked one, the Rasha. You can't call children wicked, let's be honest, right? What is he? Well, maybe he's got behavioral difficulties. He's definitely troublesome. He's rejecting, he's disassociating. His question, what's it all got to do with, you know, why should you care? Why should I care? Right? This one is a troublesome one. And contrary to normative educational strategy nowadays, the advice in the Haggadah as to how to answer the Rasha is to set his teeth on edge, make him grind his teeth. That's an interesting suggestion, that this angry child should be responded to with your anger. That you shouldn't deal with this child in a kindly, cuddling way. You shouldn't say to him there, oh, come on, don't worry about that. Come and sit on my lap and we'll have a talk about this. You don't do that. You say, with that kind of attitude, you wouldn't have come out of Egypt anyway. You don't want to connect? Imagine if you didn't connect, right? We join them in their anger. It's a very interesting concept. But what it does is it takes seriously the emotion of the Rasha. It doesn't try and smooth it away. It's, to my mind, it's a very interesting thing to play with. I just offer it to you to think about, the Rasha. The one with social and behavioral resistance, disassociating. And then you've got the simple child, the one perhaps with learning difficulties, the one that can't grasp the issues in their complexity. What does all this mean, says the child? Well, generations before modern education caught up, what the rabbis are saying is every child has a right to an education. This simple child who can't sort of think clearly still has a right to both ask the question and get an answer and to be in the classroom. This is mixed ability teaching at its best. All 4 kids in the same place and a differentiated curriculum delivered to them, but all with a right to have a curriculum that addresses the core issue, which is education about the Exodus and the consequences of it. Even the simple child. We don't hive them off and go, well, they can't learn, they're not very clever. We give them a simple job somewhere and not bother with them. Right? It's taken thousands of years for the world to catch up with this rabbinic advice, the simple child. And then you get the child who doesn't even know how to ask. Now, if you look in most Haggadot, if they're illustrated, the child who doesn't know how to ask is usually some little child. Right? Well, if any of you are anywhere near little children, you will know that one of the most infuriating things they do is they don't stop asking. Why? Well, it's just because, yes, but why? Well, because, yes, but why? Because I said so. No, right? That's why. It's a classic small child's question. This child that doesn't know how to ask is not a small child. I'll tell you what they are. They're a teenager, an adolescent. You go to a teenager with a fascinating thing and you go, hey, listen to this. And you get the eye roll. And my favorite, do you know what that is? Whatever. W-E, whatever, right? I love it, right? And you get talk to the hand because the head isn't listening, right? You get all that stuff from teenagers and they don't know how to ask. They are frequently not fascinated by fascinating stuff. You've got to trigger them. You've got to get them onto the topic. You've got to provoke them into the thing. So we've got a range of kids here. All right, you might say every kind of young person is there, but it's not true because there's a 5th person who's missing. It's the one who's not at the Seder, right? We've got these 4, even the Rasha who's going, what's he got to do with me? He's still there. I mean, what an opportunity. He's still there. You know, when somebody is angry but in the conversation, you can work with them. When somebody's walked out of the room, what do? And we know in the Jewish world that for every one of these 4 types that we can point to amongst our acquaintances, there's the 5th one that's not in the room, that doesn't want to engage, can't. It's not that this is not the one that goes, oh, it's a bit boring. That's the one that can't ask any questions. This is the one that doesn't even pay enough attention to come to a conclusion that it's boring. Right? They're just not there at all. That's the 5th child. And we have a responsibility to the 5th child too. When we come to the Messianic age, with the ingathering of the exiles, we'll have 5 children as well. That's the magic 5, folks. The 4 is not the 4, it's the 5. But let's look at the magic of Matza. I just want to finish with this, folks. Because right at the beginning of the Seder, the first time Matza makes an appearance, we'll hold it up and we say, Halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Yep, you say that? You know that line? Right at the beginning. This is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Bunkum. Don't we all know that the reason why we have matzah is because it's the bread of freedom which our ancestors ate when they left the land of Egypt? So which is it, guys? Is it the bread of affliction or is it the bread of freedom? Did they eat it in Egypt when they were slaves, or did they eat it as they were leaving Egypt when they were free? Which is it? Well, folks, the brilliant thing about matzah is it's both. And this, of course, is the glory of symbols. And I said before that you can have a picture of a bone, which is a symbol of a thing, right? Matzah is just flour and water. It isn't anything really, okay? It's just boring, actually. It doesn't do anything. It's not very exciting. It's just pretty about as dull as a foodstuff can be, right? But the meanings we place upon it are multiple. First of all, it is indubitably poor bread, isn't it? I mean, if you're making bread, you can't do anything more basic than this. There's nothing special in it, nothing fancy, right? It's just the poorest kind of bread. Sure, of course, slaves ate this kind of stuff when they were stuck in Egypt. Of course, it's the bread of affliction. Anybody who tries to persuade you that it isn't the bread of affliction hasn't eaten matzah, right? It's clearly the bread of affliction. And that's what it is. And that's what it reminds us of. Right at the beginning of the Seder, we go, this is the slave bread. But as the Seder unfolds, that matzah underneath the matzah cover is slowly undergoing a transformation. If you can't get little children to pay any other attention, get them to pay attention to what's happening to the matzah under the matzah cover, because it's going to change, right? Again, in Seder, right near the beginning, you take one of the matzot and you break it. You put one piece aside for the afikomen. Yes, you all have this. You put one piece aside for the afikomen and you slip the other piece back in between the other two matzot, right? What's going on with all this matzah? What's happening to it? Well, it is slowly going through a transmogrification. That matzah, which was slave bread, depending on how fast you go through your Seder, 20 minutes later or an hour later or 3 hours later, it will reappear. And now it will be the matzah which our ancestors baked as they fled Egypt. This matzah now is a matzah of freedom, of joy. Do you remember that fabulous time when we got up? We couldn't even bake the bread. We ended up with this stuff. Wasn't that great? Right? Because you know that if you had a great family camping holiday and it poured with rain, but you enjoyed it, you will love the memory of the rain splashing down on the tent, right? Because what happened in memory is colored by how we lived it and feel it. So the matzah has taken us through the journey of the Seder. Right at the beginning of the Seder, we say, this is slave bread. Anybody who's hungry, come and eat. We were slaves in Egypt. This is all the downbeat. This is all the history. This is all the bad news. By the time we come to the meal, we're now eating matzah because we got out. We're eating the maror, the bitter herbs, but now we're dipping them in sweet stuff because the bitterness is recalled by us in sweetness. Remember what we did right at the very beginning. We had the hors d'oeuvre, the karpas, the green vegetable, the example of rich folk having, starters, crudité, right? We don't plunge straight into food because we're rich folk, we're celebrating. But what do we do with this? We dunk it in salt water. We take the good stuff and we drench it in tears. Because the beginning of the Seder is the sad time. The beginning of the Seder is the slavery. We were slaves in Egypt, right? By the time we come to the meal, we are now going to fast. The maror is dipped in charoset. The matzah is the bread of freedom. It's great. We're here. We've arrived. And that's the dynamic of the Seder through to the meal. Now, a lot of people don't get past the meal, really. They sing a couple of songs and go to bed because nobody's got enough tunes and the kids are tired, and so they don't do the bits after the meal. But the bits after the meal are the necessary part to complete the Seder. The bits after the meal are all about, forgive me guys, but there it is, the Messianic age. It's all about the time to come. And in the time to come, this will be a golden time. You all know the mythology of the Messianic age. And if that will be a golden time, we are still living in a restricted world, right? Our lives are bounded and limited and poor and insufficient. We live in a world where there's poverty and hunger and disease and war. Come to a Messianic age and those things will be banished. We ought to be suffering. And yet we've got to the meal and we're celebrating. We got through slavery, we're out of slavery, we're free now, but we're not free now. Notice what's happened to the Matza. While you were busy eating your meal, the Matza has changed again. And it's become the Afikomen. And what is the Afikomen? The Afikomen is a substitute for the Paschal lamb. According to the Talmud, the Paschal lamb was eaten at the end of the meal because, of course, it's a sacrificial act. You're not eating it because you're hungry. You're all sitting around there with your knives and forks going, great, let's get stuck in now, right? You eat first, you satisfy your appetite, and then you eat the Paschal lamb with a level of consciousness and mindfulness that you are doing something which is commanded and resonant of history and purpose and so forth. We don't have the Paschal lamb anymore. So we have the Afikomen instead. So now suddenly this roast lamb turns into a dead bit of matzah. And straight after the meal, we are once again on the roller coaster of the Seder that tells us, you know, you were feeling high at the end of the meal. Well, guys, we're not there yet. There's much more to do. This is when we pour the fifth cup. It's when we open the door to Elijah. It's when we sing the songs which are all about how one day it'll be different. And if you don't want to take that on board, let's just finish with, as Seders do, Chad Gadya, one little kid. Because this is it's a children's song, isn't it? It's an endless sequence of this one eating that one and beating that one and swallowing the other one and winning over the other one. And all of that is perfectly good kids stuff. We all know there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. It's just another one of those. By the way, I wrote a version of Chad Gadya to the tune of There Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly. My father once bought a sweet little kid, just twopence he bid to purchase that kid. That's what he did. Along came a cat who ate the kid. That's just what it did. It ate the kid. The cat ate the kid that father had bought. The twopence he bid to purchase that kid. That's what he did. And so on, right? And all of that's just fine. We all know how songs like that go. They're fun, aren't they? Until we come to the last two verses. Then along came the angel of death. He could just use he ended the future of that little butcher. The butcher who was slaughtered, he slaughtered the cow was slaughtered, that drank the water was drunk, that doused the fire was doused, that burnt the stick was burnt, that beat the dog was beaten, that bit the cat was bitten, that ate the kid father had bought, just twopence he bid. The cat ate the kid that father had bought, just twopence he bid to purchase that kid. That's what he did. The angel of death? What's he doing in a kid's song? And that's not the end. Then heavenly God just used his breath. He just used his breath to get rid of death. And so it goes on. God kills the angel of death. When does that happen? The Messianic age. Folks, the whole story of the Seder takes us through these ups and downs of where we are. Yes, we are kind of slaves, but we are kind of free. But yes, the freedom isn't complete. But yes, we hope for a great freedom. We can only have 4 cups, but there is a 5th cup. We can only gather 4 people around us, but there is a 5th person. We can only ask 4 questions, but there is a 5th question to ask. This is the magic of the Seder, and enjoy the trip. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I think we have a bit of time.
Well, we'll let people digest the non-matzah, not the figurative matzah. We'll let them digest it and ask questions. While they're doing it, I'll start with a few questions for you. I was listening to something, I don't know if you have this. There's something called Clubhouse, where it's this new concept on your iPhone where you can get into a discussion. So it's kind of like Zoom, but there's no images. And it's very popular to get into. And yesterday I was listening to Ellie Kampfer talk to some specialists about how to make your Seder unique and special. And so one person suggested that actually said she puts debate questions under people's plates, and then they have to pull up their plate and debate something. So for example, I can now do a debate. She calls them plate debates. So one could be matzah, is it bread of freedom or bread of slavery? So you can have them debate what it is, and then we could use your discussion as to where it ends up. So I like that. Are there any other plate debates or debates we should have at the Seder that you can recommend on one foot?
Well, can I suggest first or straight off, is slavery just ancient?
Yeah, I'm writing these down. So
there's masses of modern slavery, and we see it all around us. Actually, we don't even notice. I don't know how it is exactly in the United States, but nail bars and obviously extreme points like prostitution and so on, just great advantage taken of people. But there's all kinds of slavery in agricultural work, I suspect, probably a fair bit. I think that's a discussion to be had. I think why do we not hate Egyptians is interesting to me. For 3,000 years, Jews have been sitting their children down every year and saying to them, the Egyptians were really horrible to us, right? And yet, oddly enough, Jews don't hate Egyptians. It's very strange. When the Sadat-Begin peace accord was struck and Egypt opened up, Jews dashed off there. The Israelis were crammed into Egypt. They just wanted to be there, go there. It was fascinating to them. It's very strange how contemporarily we carry much more angst and aggression against those who have been unpleasant to us than we do about those guys back there. You probably know that in Roman times, one of the biggest Jewish communities in the world was in Alexandria in Egypt. And of course, there's long-standing Egyptian Jewish community until the 40s and 50s. Maimonides lived in Egypt. He didn't sit there going, "Well, I don't think this is the right place to be," right? Like many modern people might feel about living in Poland or Germany. But Maimonides didn't have any such feeling. So that's quite interesting. What is it? Why did we not teach hate? Why did we not teach hate? Or perhaps a different question, how can we avoid teaching hate? Because obviously others are very good at it. And perhaps we are now too, in different directions. So that's another possible question. Seder question.
Do you, what do you think of Dayenu? That in my house, I now have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and that's the one song. They just love Dayenu. I can't,
Yeah.
the funniest thing. You sing
It's
any other song.
it's a great tune. It doesn't make any sense, of course, because after sort of verse 6 or something, is if God had taken us into the middle of desert and just left us there, that would have been enough. We go, no, it wouldn't. Right? We need to come out. And right. So actually, the individual verses don't make any sense. But I've done a lot of model Sedarim for non-Jews. Christian groups and educational groups and stuff. And we always sing a few verses of Dayenu together because it's rambunctious and enjoyable. But I describe it as a count your blessings song, right? And if you want to count your blessings, it's a good thing to break your blessings down. That is to not simply, it's like saying brachot, right? Ideally, you don't just look at your plate of food and go, thanks, that's great, right? It would be lovely to say, thanks for the carrots. And these peas, and that fish was tremendous. I really enjoy my drink, right? So that would be lovely. That makes your world sparkle. And I think Dayenu does that. But one of the lovely things I came across as a practice, which I recommend to you, is to ask each person around the table to say their own Dayenu. If God had only done this for me, that would have been enough. That's quite nice. You don't have to sing it. But one of the wonderful things about liturgy in Hebrew is most people haven't got a clue of what they're saying. And that means to say you can just abandon yourself to the fun of it. And Dayenu does that. If you really understood it, you'd be slightly more unsure about whether it makes any sense at all.
So what's your take? People, one comment was the reason we don't hate the Egyptians is because the story is really built, the biblical story is built on Pharaoh and hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh being the one that makes decisions. So it's not the Egyptians, it's Pharaoh. So maybe that's why we don't. But let's talk about Pharaoh for a second, hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Can you talk about that from your perspective and why that is so critical and it's challenging as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive challenge, isn't it? I think that's a nice point, by the way. In fact, the Torah talks about how the Egyptians pressed upon the Israelites jewelry and stuff, so that when they went, they went equipped. So you're right. The Egyptians themselves, as individuals, are not particularly painted as an unpleasant lot. And there's even some discussion about whether those midwives who allow the Israelite children to be born after Pharaoh's decreed that their boys should be killed. There's some debate about whether those midwives are Egyptian midwives serving the Hebrews or whether they're Hebrew midwives. And certainly the daughter of Pharaoh saves Moses, and there's all kinds of stuff like that. But the hardening of Pharaoh's heart on the face of it appears utterly unacceptable. God appears to make it impossible for Pharaoh to repent, to change his mind. God's got a plan. He wants the 10 plagues to be administered. He wants people to see his power. And therefore, at points where Pharaoh starts to weaken, God hardens his heart. First off, I'm going to say, I'm not going to try and kind of with one bound I'm free and I can sort it all out for you and tell you there's no problem. Because I think if we're troubled by it, we ought to be troubled by it. We ought to let the tension of it live as an issue. But what I would say is this, that it never says that God will change Pharaoh's mind. It only says that he will effectively strengthen his resolve. Right? So that what God is going to do is he's going to accelerate the story, intensify the story, make it all happen in a brief time, rather than have Pharaoh say, oh, well, maybe we won't carry on with this for now, and then 6 months down the line go, actually, no, let's do it. Right? So hardening his heart is not the same as changing his mind. It's absolutely not the same as changing his mind. Preventing him from changing his mind. I think the suggestion is that Pharaoh is already set on the path, and God just intensifies the path that he's set on. But I think it's good to live with a sense of unease about that. I think it's very good. Just by the way, for those of you, again, that have illustrated Haggadot, the picture of the killing of the firstborn nearly always has some weeping mother standing over a crib with a dead baby in it, or something like that, right? Just remember, it's really important to remember, that the vast majority of firstborns are adults, right? This is not the killing of children, the slaying the firstborn. This is killing of leaders, the heads of families, the eldest son, the big shots, right? Now, that doesn't mean to say that children didn't die, but the mental image of it should not be lots of dead babies. The mental image of it should be the decapitating of the Egyptian power system, right? The firstborn was the leader, the authority within the family. You take that away, you really have smacked the whole system down. It's worth bearing that in mind.
And just to go over something, when you were talking about number 5, when you're talking about the dimensions, the 4 dimensions. So did you say this? Because it comes up in the question that Dale asks or poses or talks about. Is the 5th dimension the messianic dimension? Is that part of the number 5?
It could be. It's a time out of time somehow,
right.
Or a time when, a time and a place where time and place doesn't work like we know it. I can't talk about the 5th dimension except as a pop group from the 1960s, but it is something we don't understand, and the Messianic age is something we don't understand. And I don't think we're supposed to spend a lot of time trying to contemplate the mechanics of the Messianic age. We're supposed to spend much more time trying to get to it. It'll look after itself somehow. It's a bit like life after death, right? Trying to figure out what heaven looks like, or how people are saved, or what happens to your soul if you've been married to 3 people and you get to heaven and they're all there. All that kind of mechanical worry is not what you're supposed to be thinking about. What you're supposed to be thinking about is, let's assume there's something good there. How do I get there? What do I have to do? And I think the same thing goes with the Messianic age, or the Messiah. We don't know what any of this is like, but how do we make it happen? How do we get the world ready for it? That, I think, is the challenge. But yeah, it could be fifth dimension, maybe.
I like it that way. Then it ties into your 5. So we'll give Dale a star for that one.
Yeah.
Before we finish up, let's see. I'm crowdsourcing everybody, so please email me good debate questions for the Seder, so I can have debates this year at my Seder to the best of my ability. So email me. We got some good ones, and I'll ask Clive to email me as well. Maybe if you send me them in the next, I'll give you 1 hour. I will send them back to everybody. So you know
what time it is here?
Yeah. It's an hour earlier, actually.
Yeah, you're right. You changed the clocks.
You have an excuse. Let's end with a question Elise asked, which is, since you mentioned that you've done Seders for non-Jews, Christians. I always love that the non-Jews, you think they go around calling themselves non-Jews.
Yeah.
What are you? I'm a non-Jew. Yeah. Anyway, but can you tell us stories about like what you've learned by doing Seders with people who are Christian or who are not Jewish? Is there anything that you've learned that you can share with us, whether humorous or serious or both?
Yeah, well, I have done many. I've done a model Seder in Westminster Abbey. I've done all kinds of things. I did go to an abbey. They got 300 people to come to this Seder. When I got in the room, they got these great tables laid out for the meal and stuff. And I've devised my own little, it's called the Seder Handbook, little English version of the Seder, so you can get through it in about an hour or so. They'd put out all these booklets, and they'd put out wine, and they'd put out little Seder plates in all the places. And the lights were dimmed, and it was tremendously pious, because this is an abbey, right? And what we want is an atmosphere of religiosity and serious spiritual, whatever it is, right? So the first thing I did when I came in was like, can we turn the lights on? And nobody can see anything. I mean, this is no good, right? And try to break this into the domestic hubbub of a Seder. You know, it's a domestic thing, isn't it? It's not a church experience. It doesn't go on in a museum or a library. It goes on in a dining room, and there's noise and chat and stuff. So trying to get them to get that atmosphere is really very important and quite difficult, because people want to be very reverential, and when they pass a cup of wine, they always pass it like that, you know, just grab it and drink. All right, but tremendously reverential. So that's one thing I learned. A child in a school Seder, when I asked, what do you think the salt water represents? They said, is it the crossing of the sea? Well, I think that's cute. I mean, it doesn't quite work, but I quite like the idea of the crossing of the sea. And we use parsley as our carapace, as the green vegetable. Different people use different things. But at another Christian Seder, somebody suggested, does it represent the hyssop used to paint the blood on the doorposts? So parsley with the salt water representing the blood on the doorposts, that's quite cute as well. And one thing I've always quoted my dad at all of these Sederim, Dad always used to say, God is not a milkman. Now, I don't know if in California you know what a milkman is, but here in Britain, we used to have a chap, nearly always a man, who would come around in the early morning and deliver your bottles of milk to your door. All right, he'd leave them on the doorstep. And because, you know, so you'd order 2 bottles of milk a day or something, but sometimes you didn't want 2 bottles of milk a day because you hadn't drunk all the milk from the day before or something. So you'd leave a note out for the milkman. Dear milkman, just 1 pint today, or dear milkman, 3 pints a day, or whatever, and he'd do that, right? And Dad would say, when we talk about the angel of death going over the houses, God is not a milkman. By which he meant, why did we have to put the blood on the doorposts? Surely God knows who's living in the house. I mean, a milkman needs a note, but God doesn't need a note. Why do we have to put the blood on the doorposts? And Dad would say, this is because, he said every year, we all have to sit there and look interested. This is because if there had been an Israelite who said, I'm not putting blood on the doorposts. This is a straight provocation to the Egyptians. It shows that we killed a lamb. Remember that some argue that the Egyptians thought of sheep as sacred animals, and so to kill a lamb would be terrible. In fact, you didn't just kill it, remember, you had to take it and set it in your yard for 3 days while it bleated away as a terrible embarrassment, right? As you trying to silence this lamb, the silence of the lambs, trying to silence this lamb is bleating away. It's betraying you with every bleat. And then finally you kill it. And as if that's not bad enough, you then splash the blood on the front door. And if that's not bad enough, you have to cook it whole, right? You are not allowed to say, I'm going to strip the meat off this thing and I'm going to cook it in a stew so I can, when they come in and investigate, I can claim that it's chicken. You can't do that. You've got to cook it so it looks like a lamb, right? There's no way out. So you can imagine that there must have been a few Israelites who said, I don't think I'm going to do this. This is going to get us into big trouble. I am not doing it, right? Meanwhile, there must have been a few Egyptians who are saying, oh, wait a minute. When Moses said blood, there was blood. When he said frogs, there were frogs. When he said hail, there was hail. When he said darkness, there was darkness. And now the Israelites are painting blood on their doorposts. I don't know what it's all about, but I'm going to paint some blood on too. And they splash blood on their doorposts. And when the angel of death comes by, he's the milkman. If there's blood on the doorpost, leave him alone. If there's not blood on the doorpost, do him in. And that means that the angel of death was not operating racially. He wasn't saving Israelites and killing Egyptians. He was saving believers and killing dissenters, disassociates. And that, I think, is a very important lesson. That this was not some racial thing, that just because a Jew was born a Jew, they were automatically saved. They had to do something in order to prove that they were committed to the promised redemption. And if an Egyptian happened to do the same thing, well, he was in the game too. That was my dad's story. And that's one that seems to have gone down nicely with non-Jewish audiences.
Thank you. So I am looking forward to Pesach in Westminster Abbey with you in a few years when my kids are older. Ahuva already booked her ticket. I saw her doing it as we're on the phone. Ahuva, we don't even have a year yet. So you have to call them up and secure space if that's okay. I don't want to let you go. It's too much fun. But I let me ask you one more question.
By the way, can I say the last time I was in Westminster Abbey, I was there with Harry and Meghan. It was almost exactly a year ago now. It was just after Purim. And the Commonwealth has an annual Commonwealth service in Westminster Abbey. And that was Harry and Meghan's last public appearance as royals. And it was that evening that Prince Charles tried to kill me. He shook me firmly by the hand, and he then subsequently went down with COVID. But he failed, and I'm still here to tell the tale. Yeah.
Were you invited there by the royal family, or you just happened to be there? I mean, did you invite yourself?
No. No, I was invited by the royal family. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm chief executive of something called the Commonwealth Jewish Council. So we're part of the Commonwealth family, and I have effectively right of access to all these fancy shindigs. So yeah.
Good to hear. Okay, so I'll ask you the last question. So your thoughts on the 10 plagues?
Oh, well, I mean, they are brilliant. They are a progressive smashing up of the Egyptian belief system, right? So all the gods of the Egyptians are demonstrated to be incapable of standing against God. First of all, the River Nile, the blood and the water and the blood. And then all the things that it produces, and the animals, which are all within the Egyptian theological structure, and the sun, of course, critically, the blotting out of the sun in the plague of darkness. And ultimately, as I mentioned before, the killing of the firstborn, who are the priesthood of the Egyptian people. By the way, it was intended that amongst the Israelites, the firstborns would also be the priesthood until they blew it at the golden calf and it transferred to the Levites. So the plagues are a progressive process of demonstrating to the Egyptians, especially the Egyptian leadership, that their gods simply cannot stand against God. And it's interesting to watch in the narrative how the penny slowly drops for them, how eventually the magicians who are able to kind of match what goes on initially eventually say, this is the finger of God. That famous expression, this is the finger of God. They could see that this is stuff they could not explain, they couldn't deal with. I'm not overly worried by the suffering of the Egyptians in the 10 plagues. I mean, it is very unfortunate, but I am much more concerned about the suffering of folk in the contemporary world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time beating myself up on something that happened 3,000 years ago, when in my own world and on my own TV screen, I see stuff far worse. I mean, this fire that's just happened now in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. These people who've been chased out of Myanmar, and I don't know what anybody's doing for them. Nearly 1 million refugees crammed into that space. Or the war which is developing between Ethiopia and Eritrea, or the suffering of the Uyghurs in China, or the collapse of civil liberties in Hong Kong, or any number of things that are happening in our own communities in places that ought to be far better than they are. So these are contemporary plagues. And if the 10 plagues give me a capacity at some kind of realization that the world is not perfect and it's down to us to make it work. That's all I'm going to do with the plagues, really. I think it's really important to not be too literalist with narrative, by which I mean it's not whether it's fact or not fact, but whether it's true or not true. I mean, the Egyptian people suffered any number of plagues because of how they were ruled and who they were ruled by. I mean, the 10 plagues we know of that happened over a brief period are as nothing to the endless plagues that we don't know of that happened over hundreds of years. Those are the things that must have truly troubled your average Egyptian. Or perhaps it didn't, because they didn't even know any better than that. So I'm going to duck that one, Ari.
Okay. No, you didn't really duck it. You answered it. You addressed it. I'll end with this last one. Gail says, well, you said you're Orthodox. However, you don't talk like a U.S. Orthodox person who she would know. And so we kind of addressed, we had Rafi Zarim, Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarim,
Right. He's a good man.
And he did a program about the legacy of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And in that context, we talked about how Orthodoxy is different in Europe than it is here. So I guess the question would be, do you fit within the Orthodoxy in England, or are you also are you an outlier within your Orthodoxy over there?
I would think the Orthodox community thinks of me as a bit of a maverick. I'm unorthodox, not non-Orthodox. And of course, let's remember the term Orthodox was anyway coined by progressive Jews as a kind of an insult. And the Orthodox were so stupid they didn't realize, and they go, oh, are we? Oh, okay. And they kind of took the title on. I mean, it's not something I'm particularly proud of. And nearly all of these labels are designed to divide us, not to define us, I think. So they're not something I'm very interested in. I mean, Rafi is a good mate, and I think he's also quite unorthodox. But that's partially because he's got a significant chunk of Yemenite in him. So already there's a bit of something not quite normal about Rafi. And I think, Jonathan Sacks was brought up in an excellent boys' public school, private school, which is called Christ College. So there's something not quite normal about Jonathan either, who's another, unfortunately, lost mate. And my mum was from Gibraltar, who are a Sephardi lot. Gibraltar has the highest proportion of Jews of any country in the world, other than Israel. Isn't that strange? But there's only 30,000 people in the entire country, so that's not clever. The Gibraltarians have a strange kind of way of doing Jewish. So I think that, we're all a bit odd, aren't we? That's the wonderful thing about it. And the more we try and corral ourselves into boxes, is go, well, you're Reform, aren't you? So I know all about you. Or you're conservative, so I've got you pinned down. These are very unhelpful things because they stop us asking questions. What I should be saying is, so what do you think about this? And it might be that some of you actually are more orthodox, if that's the word, about some of the things I've talked about than I am. And I might be more conservative with a small c or a capital C about some things than some of you are, or more reform-minded than others might be, or more liberal, or whatever labels you want to put on it. The labels are not Jewish, as is evident by the fact that they're nearly always expressed in English words. They're not Jewish labels. They're not helpful to the Jews. And they are Ashkenazi entirely. And remember that Ashkenazim are Christian Jews. Sephardim are Muslim Jews, right? And Christians rejoice in the capacity to burn each other on small matters of doctrinal difference. And Ashkenazim have learnt that lesson extremely unhelpfully. Muslims, until the recent explosions between Shia and Sunni, had been much more relaxed about davening together. So until now, a Sunni or a Shia can go into each other's mosque and daven perfectly well. It's not an issue, right? They know what's going on. They all do it the same way. It's all very simple. They're much more, come on, guys, you know, our differences don't separate us until the 20th century, when I think, again, they learnt this from the West. It's not really an authentic Muslim way to do it. So, yeah, I'd like to think I'm unorthodox. I'd be very proud of that if that's true. And the Jewish world in Britain doesn't quite know what to do with me, which is why I keep having to take refuge in other places. And so thank you for having me.
It's been a treat, as always. I think we'll have to have you back for Shavuot. So let's get
Okay.
that on the schedule. It's coming up, you know, after Pesach, right? We count down.
Yeah, start counting, guys.
Not yet.
Yeah,
Not yet.
But odd, we count up, not count down. That's not what you do when you're trying to launch a rocket, is it? How strange. Maybe we'll discuss that.
Yeah, maybe we will. So everybody, Chag Sameach, wishing you all an unorthodox holiday. If you're in the United States, you're probably celebrating this year with a small group, maybe in the backyard. Not like last year. Last year was definitely on Zoom for those who use Zoom. And Clive will be having a Seder by yourself, or what are you doing?
I have my partner with me. So,
okay.
Yeah, there'll be two of us.
Glad you have company, and wishing you all a happy, healthy, particularly healthy Pesach. If I don't see you tomorrow, and if I do see you tomorrow, that's great. We can talk more. Clive, enjoy your extra hour tonight.
Thank you.
Use it wisely. Everybody else.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Send me your good debate questions, okay? Email me. Bye, everybody. Have a good one. Chag Sameach.